The medieval battlefield was not chaos. It was not clumsy men in heavy armor stumbling through the mud, swinging oversized swords like they were tree trunks. No, that image belongs to Hollywood, not history. The real Crusader was something else entirely. He was a professional killer, trained from childhood, disciplined in arts of violence that we can barely imagine today. And the weapons he carried? They were not crude tools. They were not primitive. They were the cutting edge of their time, engineered with a single purpose: to kill more efficiently than the enemy. The Crusades weren't just holy wars. They were a laboratory of death, a brutal testing ground where European, Byzantine, and Islamic technologies collided, adapted, and evolved. Every battle was a trial. Every campaign was a forge. Out of this crucible emerged weapons so advanced, so horrifyingly effective, that they reshaped the art of killing for centuries to come. And here's the part that should stop you cold. They did all of this without gunpowder, without explosives, without modern metallurgy. No dynamite, no rifles, no tanks. And yet, they created weapons that could split skulls through helmets, crush ribs through plate, and slice limbs from bodies with surgical precision. Today, we're going to step into that world. We're going to walk onto the battlefield of the Crusades, not as tourists of history, but as witnesses to the arsenal of destruction that made men into legends and left others broken in the dirt. But first, you need to understand the psychology. Medieval warfare wasn't just about killing. It was about fear, about symbols, about breaking the enemy's spirit before the first blow ever landed. The weapons of the Crusaders weren't only tools of death, they were weapons of terror, each carrying its own sound, its own shape, its own reputation, whispered across battlefields and carried through generations. Let's begin with the weapon that defined an age: the sword. When a Crusader knight unsheathed his blade, he was not just drawing steel. He was drawing the cross of Christ. The crossguard was no accident. It was deliberately shaped to echo the crucifixion, turning every sword into a holy symbol. To the knight, this was more than a weapon. It was faith made tangible, faith sharpened to a killing edge. Forget the heavy, clumsy swords of movies. The typical Crusader sword was a masterpiece of balance, 70 to 80 centimeters long, perfectly weighted for one-handed combat. It was light enough for quick movements, heavy enough to shear through flesh and bone, and versatile enough to thrust into the weak points of armor. A trained knight could fight for hours without tiring, because the sword was not a burden. It was an extension of his body. The steel itself was the secret. European smiths, especially those in Toledo, Spain, had inherited techniques going back to Rome. Their swords could hold an edge sharp enough to bite through chainmail while remaining flexible enough to withstand the shock of battle. But then, in the East, the Crusaders discovered something even deadlier: Damascus steel. These blades shimmered with watery patterns, strange ripples that seemed almost magical. They were forged from Wootz ingots imported from India and Sri Lanka, metal with a unique crystalline structure. Damascus steel could bend without breaking, slice with impossible sharpness, and retain its edge through endless combat. Chronicles describe them cutting through European swords, shearing helmets in half, even slicing silk in midair. To face a warrior armed with Damascus steel was to face a nightmare. Your own blade would glance uselessly off his armor, while his cut through yours like parchment. This was more than technology, it was psychological dominance. Soldiers carried those memories home, spreading stories of Eastern swords that seemed alive, blades that belonged more to legend than reality. But the sword was only one part of the Crusaders' arsenal. Now imagine something far more brutal, a weapon that didn't care about finesse or training or precision, a weapon that anyone could pick up and use with devastating effect. That weapon was the mace, a simple wooden shaft, a heavy metal head. That's all it was. Yet it was enough to shatter the strongest armor, crush skulls into fragments, and cave in rib cages as if they were nothing. Unlike the sword, the mace did not demand years of practice. It was democratized destruction. If you could swing with force, you could kill. engineers improved the design. Flanged maces split helmets open like eggs. Spiked maces punched through steel. Knobbed heads delivered multiple impacts with each strike, turning one blow into a barrage of bone-shattering trauma. Archaeological evidence from Crusader battlefields shows skulls fractured so violently that modern experts classify the injuries as unsurvivable. But it wasn't just the death it caused. It was the sound. Warriors learned to recognize the distinct, sickening crunch of a mace striking armor. That noise alone could freeze men in terror. It wasn't just a sound. It was a promise. Someone's war had ended. Permanently. From brutality, we moved to precision. The battle axe. Axes were cheaper to make than swords, easier to use, and far more versatile. Their design was dual. The blunt weight of the head could collapse armor through sheer force, while the sharpened edge could carve through flesh and mail with terrifying ease. Chroniclers tell stories of limbs severed in single blows, so cleanly cut that victims sometimes didn't realize until they tried to move. But the axe was more than a chopper. Knights used it to hook shields away, drag riders off horses, or target the joints of armor. Combat manuals describe systematic techniques for dismantling an opponent with an axe, breaking defenses, destabilizing balance, then delivering the killing strike. The axe was no crude tool. It was a calculated instrument of dismantling, designed to tear apart man and armor alike. Yet even the axe bowed before the poleaxe, the ultimate infantry weapon of the Middle Ages. Picture a weapon as tall as a man, built with one purpose: to annihilate armor. On one side, a razor-sharp axe blade. On the other, a hammer designed to pulverize steel and bone. At the top, a thrusting spike to pierce mail, joints, or visors. And all of it reinforced with riveted langets, strips of metal to ensure the shaft couldn't be broken in combat. The poleaxe was not chaos. It was precision. Medieval manuals describe techniques that read more like surgical instructions. Hook the leg, pry open the visor, spike the throat, crush the knee. Archaeological remains confirm it. Skeletons with clean punctures through joints, skulls split with terrifying accuracy, bodies systematically dismantled. The word poleaxed comes from this weapon, a grim reminder of executions where captives were struck down with a single, final blow. To face a poleaxe was not just to risk death, it was to risk annihilation, piece by piece. And then came the weapon that shook the entire social order of medieval Europe: the crossbow. For centuries, knights ruled the battlefield. Armored, mounted, trained from childhood, they were nearly untouchable. But the crossbow changed everything. Suddenly, a common peasant with a few weeks of practice could fire a bolt capable of piercing plate armor at 200 meters. Some crossbows generated more than 1,200 pounds of draw weight, hurling bolts with such force they passed through one man and into another behind him. The bolts themselves were engineered for maximum devastation. Bodkin points spread chainmail apart. Broadheads shredded flesh. Hardened tips concentrated force into tiny points, punching through steel. This wasn't just weaponry, it was social revolution. Expensive, highly trained knights could now be killed by peasants at a distance. The feudal order trembled. The church panicked. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council tried to ban the crossbow, declaring it too inhumane for use against Christians. But bans don't win wars. Armies that adopted crossbows slaughtered those who didn't. The knightly class would never again be invincible. And if handheld weapons were terrifying, siege weapons elevated warfare into apocalypse. The trebuchet was the titan of the medieval battlefield. A massive counterweight engine capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds across hundreds of meters with deadly accuracy. Castle walls that once seemed impenetrable crumbled under sustained bombardment. But destruction was only part of its power. The trebuchet was psychological warfare. Chronicles describe diseased corpses flung into cities to spread plague, severed heads launched to demoralize defenders, and barrels of flaming pitch or Greek fire raining down from the skies. The message was clear. Resistance was not only futile, it was horrifying. These were not crude catapults. They were calculated machines, designed with precision mathematics, their counterweights measured, their trajectories plotted. Medieval engineers may not have had modern tools, but they understood balance, stress, and leverage to a degree that rivals modern physics. So let us strip away the myths once and for all. The Crusaders were not bumbling knights with dull blades. They were professional killers carrying the most advanced weapons of their time. Their swords were faith turned into steel. Their maces were brutality made simple. Their axes were instruments of precision carnage. Their poleaxes were surgical annihilators. Their crossbows shattered centuries of social order. And their siege engines turned fortresses into rubble and morale into ash. The Crusades were not only battles of religion. They were the proving grounds of human ingenuity under the most brutal conditions imaginable. The weapons forged in that fire did not just take lives. They reshaped warfare, redefined tactics, and laid technological foundations that would echo through centuries. And that is the legacy of Crusader weapons. They remind us of something uncomfortable, something we'd rather forget. When humanity devotes its intelligence, its craftsmanship, its brilliance entirely to war, the results are terrifying. They are efficient, they are devastating, and they endure. The next time you see a knight on screen, clanking an armor, swinging a clumsy sword, remember the truth. These were not primitive men. These were weapons themselves, flesh and blood, trained and tempered, carrying steel born from fire and faith. They did not stumble through the dark ages. They carved their way through it, with crosses of steel, with maces of iron, with bolts of death, and with stones hurled from machines as precise as any modern gun. The Crusaders weren't just warriors. They were the sharpened edge of history, and their weapons were the tools that cut it.